Welcome to lit.happensse, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally.
Well, welcome back everyone to lit.happensse. I'm Adriel and I'm joined by Belle today, and we are your dedicated teachers again, and we're actually diving into Module 8 Textual Conversations. However, this time we're exploring Shakespeare's The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's Hagseed. In this episode, I guess we're going to be looking at a few essential sort of resources for navigating this comparative study in particular. And we're going to look at a few key themes. We've got a few segments planned where we analyze each part of the text in depth with our wonderful Belle here. She's been working away. And we're ready to look at a few of these key ideas, especially, when it comes to like those resonances and dissonances. And to have a bit of a caveat at the end, we've got a few sort of ideas to do with, developing some of these great thesis sort of statements that we will need for our essays later on. So, without any further ado, let's get started with the following sort of question. Yeah, what do you think, Bill? Well, we're going to start to look at purpose.
Okay.
We're going to start to look at purpose. So, I guess, what is the purpose of the Textual Conversations module, and how does it enhance our understanding of literature?
Okay. Yes, we're going to be doing Tempest Hagseed today. Very, very popular combination comparatively with different schools and what they do. And we're going to start with just really quickly recapping the purpose of the rubric again. Remember that we're looking at, it's all about how one text influences our reading of another, and then how that intertextuality and connection between them really enhances our appreciation of literature as a whole and of those texts, not just independently, but together. So the module is really trying to encourage that deep engagement with multiple texts so that you can explore the relationship between and among them. And hopefully your students get to a point where they understand the universality of the aspects of the text, usually the ideas, but also perhaps characterization wise, different character arcs, different motifs and structural features. I know that going kind of thematically is a really nice anchor for the students, and I think it really helps, especially when your texts are quite separated by context. And maybe using that as the anchor, and then we'll get into more the context, how it changes the meaning and how meaning is reshaped in the new text. So again, it's about the similarities, the differences, so that you can get a richer understanding of the meaning, of the themes in the text, of the characters, of the development, of the conflicts, the cultural aspects, even the language features. So we're really looking at today how The Tempest by William Shakespeare provides then a foundation for understanding Hagseed. And then once we actually read Hagseed and then compare it and reconsider it in light of the original Tempest, we're really going to see how Margaret Atwood really helps us to reimagine a more contemporary reflection of some really timeless ideas that the Tempest has brought forth.
Yeah, I love that. I love that sort of idea where you've got this comparative study module as a way of looking at two texts side by side and how they, again, we say talk to each other. And I think you've just sort of hit the nail on the head here where you said it's not just about spotting what is similar or different, which is like our starting point, but it's about how one text can change the way you read the other. And that's that idea of reimagining or reframing, which is fantastic. I'm looking forward to what you have to say about these. So,
oh God, no pressure.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. So, yeah, look, let's just jump into the text then, and we'll get started with our first sort of analysis of The Tempest. So, what are some key themes and concepts that we should focus on in our analysis for this classic play?
Yeah, like you said, extremely classic play. I thought I might just start off with a bit of a summary that might have some analysis features within, but just a nice kind of starting point. So obviously the Tempest, written by William Shakespeare, it was the last play that he wrote. So a lot of the philosophical musings that the protagonist Prospero has, there's a lot of criticism and literary discussion out there about how perhaps Shakespeare was using Prospero to, in a way, also have his own musings on, the end of, of this great, I guess, play that was his life, not so much the play Tempest, but, because Prospero, so he's in our play, he's the protagonist, he's a sorcerer who is also the rightful Duke of Milan. Now, the story begins by he and his daughter, they've been stranded on a remote island. He and Miranda have been stranded there for about 12 years, so quite a long time. And so when the play begins, it begins with a tempest, a huge storm. Yeah. So hence the title, The Tempest. And the reason that Prospero actually conjures this tempest is because he's trying to cause the illusion of a shipwreck for a ship that is carrying his brother Antonio, who has usurped him and is in fact the reason that they're on this island. So very dramatic from the get-go, like very, So on the ship, oh yes, exactly. So you've got the key antagonist Antonio. On board with him is also, you've got Prince Ferdinand and his father, and then you've got a couple of other players, but really he's conjured this shipwreck. He's bided his time. He's waited 12 years and he's conjured this tempest to not only kind of, attack his enemies in a sense, but as the way that he's going to now get his revenge and reestablish himself.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other aspect. So on one hand, you've got that kind of plot line. Okay, the long game plot line. Now, Gonzalo, one of the other political figures, Prospero, explains to his daughter Miranda that the only reason we kind of survived is that Gonzalo has gave us some provisions, and they didn't think we'd make it alive on the ship, but we've landed on this island, and so he's been biding his time. Now, on the island, you also have a couple of island inhabitants, namely Caliban. Caliban is the son of a witch, Sycorax, and he is, when we're looking at this colonial period, he's the native inhabitant. Okay. Now, with Caliban, he's quite an important figure because as the play goes on, there's this story of how Prospero tries to kind of raise him and teach him, and then Caliban tries to assault his daughter Miranda, and that changes the dynamic. And Prospero has basically made him a slave, and actually uses his magic and his charms to punish him. So you've got those layers now of power and authority, and not only that, but Prospero can even conjure the dead to rise and do his bidding, along with other magical creatures, like you've got goblins and fairies and things like that. What you also have then is Ariel, who is a spirit that serves Prospero. So we also have this idea of freedom and loyalty and the quest for liberation coming through Ariel. So through these enchantments and manipulations, Prospero wants to reclaim his dukedom and restore order. So the play, through this narrative, he presents certain illusions to trick the men on board the ship. And within his, play within the play, which we know is a very famous thing that Shakespeare does, within this play, within the play, he's able to, in the end, restore his power, and they make it off the island. Ferdinand is Alonso's son, so the other Duke of, where was it? Not Milan, but was it Naples? One of the other Italian provinces. And, they were in cahoots with Antonio. So he kind of gets his revenge on Alonso, because Alonso thinks Ferdinand has died. But what he's really done with his powers is he's allowed Ferdinand to come along to his side on the island, meet Miranda, and through their love at first sight meeting, order is restored, and they make it off the island with the understanding that Prospero is going to go back to being the rightful duke. So, you've got those comedic Shakespearean comedy elements where we have to end with this happy ending and we have to end with restoring order, right? But what you also have is this tragicomedy feature. So it's very much one of his tragicomedies where the aspects of tragedy are really only tempered by this happy ending and this restoration of order. But with this play, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. So we don't know necessarily what's going to happen to Caliban. Even the end soliloquy, Prospero sort of ends this epilogue with and now I'll move on my days towards the end, and this idea of every next day is the next day towards the end of his life. So it's where we get that real philosophical musing that perhaps Shakespeare's using Prospero as this mouthpiece. But really, when the play concludes, Prospero decides he's going to forgive his enemies, he's going to relinquish his magical abilities. We might talk about perhaps what that might say in itself. And so it really, really symbolizes this personal growth and redemption that he has taken. So, sorry, you were saying that. Yeah.
No. So that's sort of a really sort of nice, thorough sort of summary of what we have happening in the Tempest. And I guess as we're sort of looking at the analysis now, you've provided a great framework for us to move into maybe some of those key themes like power and control, maybe colonization, forgiveness, redemption. So I guess we'll delve into some of those as we move forward here.
Yeah, let's do it. So when we're talking about this idea of the power, authority, and the meditation of that, remember that we are talking about, dukedoms and kingship and, those monarchical aspects of society, which obviously must be reshaped in Tempest Hagseed, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Yeah, but it's really this meditation on power, because one of the things that Prospero himself highlights is his brother Antonio was able to usurp him because Antonio said, let me help you carry all these responsibilities, while Prospero was really busy with his magic and his spells and his books. And so Prospero is really built as this, really clever, learned, magical, mad sorcerer. So I guess our mad scientist would be the most similar, but kind of, busy away studying. And in the meantime, Antonio has managed to usurp him. So we have those questions of, power and authority, but then when we look at the island, the narrative happening on the island, well, you have ideas of power and authority with, Prospero and Caliban. Like what right does Prospero have to enslave perhaps Caliban? What right does he have to engage with the other inhabitants of the island and things like that. So you have much more of a meditation on power and authority from that more colonial perspective, certainly from that Jacobean perspective. And then so what Prospero is showcasing is he is showcasing, like we are seeing his folly quite deliberately. We know that that's a very obvious comedic device of Shakespeare's. We want to represent the fallibilities of man. So we've got the complexities here. And through Prospero, we're seeing his struggle to control and the complexities of that. Because even with power and authority, his engagement with Ariel also highlights that idea of the power that he has over the spirit of Ariel. And Ariel supports him in, he has to help him do his bidding. And towards the end of the play, you can see Prospero is really reflecting because he has this moment with Ariel and he sets him free, which is going to have a really nice connection to Hagseed, but I'll talk about that really shortly. But other than that, so you've got so you've got the power, the authority, vengeance, forgiveness, because in the end, Prospero, in the play, Prospero gets his revenge. Obviously, he gets his dukedom back from Antonio, but he also gets his revenge against Alonso, who plotted against him by making him think for a short time that his son was dead. So he instills in him that I guess that sort of fear that maybe Prospero had with his little daughter sort of trying to survive on this island, So in the end, though, he decides he's going to give forgiveness. And I guess that's kind of symbolic by him, putting away his magic. He's achieved in a way what he's wanted to achieve. And he decides the magic will kind of be no more. So in this, so in the play, we've got these Jacobean contextual elements of magic, the supernatural, the complex human emotions. Shakespeare's audiences were not used to these elements. I mean, I think of Macbeth straight away, with the witches and all of those things. And certainly even with the powers that Prospero has, just the fact that he can even make the dead rise with his magic, it will make the audience question, well, is this good or bad? Is this good or evil? So there's, I think for a play that I consider not to be as dense as some of the other of Shakespeare's plays, it's really, really rich in these, musings and thought processes and, the ambiguities of our humanity. Just because we can, should we, or what do we do with the choices given to us? I think it gives a lot of nice complexity there. And then it ends on that happy ending. So there's also then the broader discussion about, human struggles or human aspirations, looking at the ethics of power within the colonized world, through Caliban, which is something that's discussed much more in Hagseed as well. But there's that real interplay here, the back and forth between what's magic and illusion and what's reality. Which we're gonna see also dealt with in a really clever way in Hagseed. But just this idea that there's this really delicate balance that has to take place between control and chaos, So if I was just going to, quickly highlight some other key issues. So you've got the power and control with Prospero's manipulation of Caliban and Ariel, and that raises the questions of authority. The colonization between Prospero and Caliban as an allegory for the colonial encounters happening in Shakespeare's time. Forgiveness and redemption, because at the end, the play is emphasizing redemption and perhaps even reconciliation. And we have some really significant quotes like, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," which is a really nice link to the really fine line between our reality and our illusions and our dreams. So it's quite, in a way, a whimsical play in that regard, I think.
No, that's awesome. You've been quite thorough there. I mean, actually going through a few of those key points, and it's fantastic sort of starting point for people that are jumping into this unit of work to have some of these key ideas.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you do give time to both your texts, so students can. I think if they appreciate them separately, then when they put them together, it's like the light bulb goes off. But I think me too. But I think the beauty with something like the Tempest is there's no reason why you can't start with them, the students actually seeing the production, or, if you've got ClickView, like a BBC version, you can give them that opportunity first to engage with that plot line, because then they'll make a lot more connections that way to Hagseed. They'll see where Atwood has been very deliberate in what she wants to keep from Shakespeare's Tempest and what she's reimagining.
Well, you sort of already made that little link there, so it's probably good for us to now jump into a little bit of an analysis of Atwood's Hagseed. So I guess now that we jump into Hagseed, what are some of the main elements that we can connect to the Tempest? And how does it reinterpret some of the original narrative that you've clearly underscored here in detail?
Sure. So let's get into Hagseed. So Hagseed was published in 2016. It is a deliberate retelling of the Tempest. It was actually a novel that was commissioned by Random House. Random House basically put together, as part of their Hogwarts Shakespeare series, Hogarth Shakespeare series. They took really well-known authors, and each of them were kind of tasked with producing a retelling of a Shakespearean play. So Margaret Atwood decided to work on The Tempest, and that, spawned her novel Hagseed. So with Hagseed, she's reimagined Prospero through the protagonist Felix. Now, obviously, much more contemporary world. But here we've got Felix. He's an art director. the play begins with him seeking revenge, and ultimately he finds redemption through the transformative power of art. So what happens for Felix is he's seeking revenge. He's been wronged as well. In a way, he's been exiled. So basically, who was his 2IC and his friend Tony? What happens to Felix, and we learn this as the play progresses, because we're sort of, when we start the novel, I should say, sorry, as the novel progresses, when we start the novel, we actually are starting with the Tempest, or Felix's version of the Tempest. So in itself, there is a nice resonance. It begins there. And then we get a bit of some flashbacks and some backward mapping to develop the backstory of Felix and where he is in that point of time with the Tempest. And then the story continues. So, you know, we learned that Felix was a very famed art director. He lost his wife shortly after childbirth and was raising his young daughter, Miranda. His sweet Miranda also dies very young at the age of 3. And in the midst of this grief that he's experiencing, Tony, who was like his second in command, actually uses that opportunity and that grief to usurp him and take over as art director. And so the board kind of votes against him, except for one board member, which is really, you know, like our Gonzalo figure, who gives him a few of his items and gives him that sense of, I didn't want to, I didn't vote for this. Anyway, we'll talk about that a bit more later. But, you know, Felix kind of in this pain and anguish and anger, he becomes a recluse for a long time, for several years. So he gets fired from that role. He doesn't take on any more roles. He goes on and he finds like an old kind of shanty, like farmhouse, and he rents that for many years. And he's in like a prison of his making there. So where for Prospero, the island is like the prison, and certainly for like Caliban, he's got like an actual cave that's like his prison. Felix has very deliberately isolated himself, So you've got a lot more emphasis in this play on the psychological imprisonment that we kind of have. So, he's been wronged all this time in exile. The spirit of his daughter, we call, he refers to Spirit Miranda, is around in this home. So in a way, he's exiled himself, and in this space, he's able to be with his Miranda and spend time with her. And, you're aware that she's a ghost. It's not like if you read the novel Vertigo, where it takes time for the author to spell out that this is an imagined child from a grieving parent. So you know that she is. He knows that. He makes comments like, but of course she doesn't need a costume change, but of course she doesn't sleep, all those things. But what kind of brings him out of this exile, where he gets to a point where his spirit Miranda, it's almost like that idea of the illusion and the reality. His grief almost has him second guessing his reality. Is she real? Isn't she real? And he makes that decision. I've got to go into the world again, And interestingly, because, Margaret Atwood's replaying here The Tempest, he takes a role as like a literary teacher, and he becomes a bit of a director in a prison, in a local prison. And so in the correctional facility, he's hired by a supervisor, Estelle. And in this facility, he is actually using Shakespeare as part of the literacy program with the inmates. So you have a cool little motley crew of additional characters here, and he decides the way to teach them is through Shakespeare. And he says to Estelle, I'll do all your literacy stuff. I'll get them to write papers, whatever. But the end goal is going to be a play, and it's going to be broadcast. And it becomes quite a successful thing. So he does this for a few years before The Tempest. So he does a few of other Shakespeare's big plays, Macbeth. You have this really cool understanding between like the inmates and Felix, how Shakespeare's characters are representing a lot of their own strife and struggle. And that's a really cool modern interpretation. We get then into, he decides he's really going to reenact his play, The Tempest. And the reason that the play is also so significant to him, not only is the character Miranda, but when his Miranda dies, he's actually getting ready to stage a production of the Tempest. And when he gets fired, that gets axed. So there's all this extra meaning to the play. It's not just a play for him, you know. It's a way to, yes, express himself and his creativity. It's a way to honor his daughter. It's a way to connect to the inmates. So then the rest of the play is sort of how he gets to staging this play. And you have a really cool, like I said, a motley crew of inmates. And what's really clever about this novel, and I really think it's really good to lean into it, when he's explaining to the inmates the characters and who they are and how they act, and, you know, when he's in the director phase, he's actually producing some really nice analysis and explaining the characterization, you know, to his inmates. And so I think if you're teaching this and you're trying to make connections back, lean into that. It's almost like this is a really great novel. I can see why it's on the HSC list, because not only is it retelling the Tempest, but it's also teaching the craft element of producing something like the Tempest. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So just to wrap up here, and I've spoken for a while, we're almost there. Just to wrap up, when he gets to the end now of, we sort of get towards the end of the novel now, he decides, yes, he's going to put on the Tempest as part of his literacy program, but he decides this is going to be my opportunity to get revenge, because the men on the board and Tony, who in his modern world usurped him, well, they've now joined politics. And they're all budding politicians and vying for power. So we've got this link back to the political system that we saw in the original Tempest. And Estelle, his supervisor, tells him they're coming to watch what he's been doing and watch his production. And so then Felix decides, I'm going to be Prospero in this play, and I'm going to use my hacker extraordinaire, 8 hands inmate, that's also playing Ariel, to play a trick on Tony and, you know, the other men, and actually get them to spill their guts, and that's how he gets his revenge. And so basically he blackmails them. Let's just be frank. Basically he blackmails them. So it's a really clever way where in his modern context he's seeking revenge on those who wronged him, but he's very deliberately playing out as Prospero, but also what Prospero did with the play within the play to trick him. So very, very obvious connections for your students to make here. The only difference is in the end, he does offer forgiveness, but in the end, there's so much possibility of new beginnings. And I'll talk about that further soon, but that's probably the main. There's almost like a reframing of where in the Tempest he gets his revenge and everything can go back to normal. In Hagseed, you know, for Felix in his life, that normal life doesn't exist anymore. But once he stages Tempest and he can let go of Miranda, he can move forward. So that's a bit of a synopsis / a little bit of analysis along the way.
Yeah. So what are some of the key ideas, I guess, in Hagseed that you'd encourage prospective teachers here to include in their focus areas?
Yeah, so again, revenge and forgiveness plays out. We see it much more deeply because we get Felix's emotional journey, I guess, over years, which you do somewhat in Tempest, but there's much more of a psychological understanding of, his feelings of revenge, but also that his feelings of revenge are not just tied to his position and his power, but the revenge is like tied to him setting himself free and being able to move on from his grief. So very much here, you can see a man who gets to the end and realizes like the revenge is like, it didn't really fulfill what he was missing, grieving. Do you know what I mean? So therefore the forgiveness occurs, but there's also that redemption and that moving forward. Art and transformation is huge in this one. So obviously Atwood is using her novel here to explore how narrative and art has the power to rehabilitate and to change lives. And
Yeah.
we see that with the inmates. So there's almost like this mystical quality to like art and literature in the novel as opposed to
Mhm.
sheer magic. And, Atwood really cleverly like replaces some of the more magical aspects by actual technology. So like the
Yeah.
hacker, they'll use technology to cut their scenes and to embed
Yeah.
special effects. So it's a
I like
very clever modern.
yeah, I like that idea. It's sort of you actually do see, from what I recall from Hagseed, Atwood actually swaps the magic that we see in the Tempest for
Yes.
theatre. And
Yes.
this falls into sort of like that line that you sort of just mentioned there, as art and transformation is quite
Yeah.
significant. So no,
Yeah.
it's definitely pretty cool. It's a cool way to look at it.
And it's really what's really clever too is she uses, so the character that helps him achieve all this, because he's a tech whiz, Eight Hands,
Mm.
because
Mm.
they've all created like stage names for themselves.
Yeah.
So that's why his real name is not Eight Hands, but that's his name in the program.
Yeah.
So Eight Hands is actually also his Ariel. So there's that kind of nod to the magic that Ariel helps with Prospero. Yeah, that's kind of being reimagined through Eight Hands and his technological
Mm.
wizardry, you might say.
Mm.
So that's really cool.
Yeah.
um Identity and self-exploration is huge. I would say it's a lot deeper in this as well than it is in Tempest, because you do have that longer scope in the prose novel, but it's not only obviously Felix who has to have a reflection on his sense of self, but other characters. So the Miranda that was going to be the Miranda in his original play before it
Yeah.
got cut, she comes forward and you get her identity. You've got, some really, really interesting and nice tidbits from the other inmates, like,
Mm. Mm.
the awareness that they have sometimes of, the revenge or all those, they're actually drawing it to their own real life, which is
Yeah.
wonderful for students, because that's the point that Atwood's trying to make. It's relevant for all of us,
Mm.
because they make a point as well in the novel about how, some of the literacy rates of the inmates. Like, I think the first thing Estelle says, like, you want to teach Shakespeare, maybe you should do this and maybe you should do that. And, Felix is like, Shakespeare is for everyone, okay? And he tells his inmates, Shakespeare was for the rich and the poor, that, the people who were in the groundlings in his plays, were also likely largely illiterate. So yeah, there's this real like camaraderie and like, yeah, that the power of art is it's for everybody. Shakespeare is for
Mm.
everyone. You can enjoy it. So
Mm.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's really nice too.
Yeah, I think you've covered quite a bit there. So they've got a few great focus areas for our teachers, and you sort of started to delve into this next little space here. We're looking at some of those resonances and
Mhm.
dissonances between the text. And again, like if we sort of simplify this, we're looking at those similarities and differences, and it manifests itself in many different terms in the rubric. You will see, resonances, dissonances,
Mhm.
connections, disconnections.
That's
These are
it.
sorts of the terms that we're looking at. But I guess as we discuss some of these resonances and dissonances between these two works, what are some of the surprising maybe
Mhm.
similarities or differences you've uncovered in
Yeah.
their themes and characters?
Yeah, I think what's really obviously resonating is the bigger themes, or the themes like power, control, redemption. I think they're all rehashed quite similarly, and obviously
Mm.
there are slight changes because of the context, but like Felix trying to get revenge and then realizing at the end like, oh, okay, I've got to do something more now. That's I think a
Yeah.
kind of nice touch here. So this idea that they're both struggling with some turmoil, but Felix even more so, and not realizing after the vengeance that wasn't actually what he needed to make him,
Mm.
happy. So yeah, I think the vengeance and all that is pretty straightforward across the two. I think what
Mm.
makes it more interesting is the way that Felix has the musing on that, and even Prospero to an extent, because in his epilogue, he makes reference to this sort of moral like ambiguity of, okay, like
Mm.
that's done now, and now I just guess move on back to my life. But I really like the motif of isolation here. So that's obviously a resonance. There are settings in both texts that represent this isolation. I think what's really, it's so obviously just the island in the Tempest, right? But I think what's really clever about Atwood is she's got a few different ones in hers. So she's got obviously the farmhouse where he spends his time with Miranda, and you've got, you know, he's sort of he's self-exiled here. So where Prospero was exiled to the island, he has exiled himself here. He has sent himself here to be isolated. But then when you get into the prison, there's obviously, you know, the literal confinement of the inmates, but you know, the ways in which our sense of self can be confined and lack freedom. So yeah, I think that psychological aspect of solitude and the journey to redemption, like Felix has to come to this understanding on his own. He has to free himself, I guess, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
like in that beginning sort of part, you've sort of mentioned some of these ideas as to how they both dig into this idea of power, which is one of the key themes or ideas that you've looked at. And I think you mentioned this idea that Prospero has his sort of magic, and then for Felix, it's that idea of the theater.
Yes.
So we've got those
Yes.
sorts of ideas there. You've got like towards the end, I think you also mentioned this when you're doing this analysis, revenge turning to forgiveness for both texts, or you know, isolation maybe shaping the leads of either sort of text there. But I sort of see this with both of the texts, which you sort of covered in quite a bit of depth. Prospero and Felix are both control freaks, you know, and we sort of see them both
Yes.
soften up by
Yeah.
the end of their respective texts. And those are some key ideas that you're sort of moving into
That's so
here
true. And
that
I
highlights some of those.
really,
Yeah. No, exactly.
I agree completely. And for me, what I always can't get over is like that moral ambiguity. Like, okay, just because Prospero has magic, does that mean he has a right to use it to manipulate and trick people?
Yeah.
And in some respects, I felt that reading the novel Hagseed with Felix too. So, you know, he's got the inmates. I guess I think the slight difference is he lets his inmates in on how he's going to ruin these men, and they're excited to play along. But again, this idea of, you know, Felix in the prison world, you know, he's got power in different ways. Like, yes, he's a freed man, but he's got the power of literacy and art, and you know, manipulation and stagecrafting. And there's parts of, there's moments where I'm also like, just because he can, does that mean he should? And that's not, you know, a question that's answered in either text. And that's, for me, the beauty of it, is we can all have this musing. So yeah, I find that kind of resonates as well, that the moral ambiguity of power and control and what you do with it.
That's fantastic. So you've covered a few resonances there. Let's dive into a few of these dissonances that you saw stand out to you in particular, and something that teachers can really get a hold of when we're looking at the textual conversation. You know, like, how does one text speak with the other in order for that reimagining, reframing, or reshaping that we sort of see in the rubric?
Yeah. So one of the dissonances, so they both texts deal with, you know, power in terms of the entrapment of Caliban. And you know, obviously we've got that 17th century colonial context, whereas in Atwood's novel we've got a more ironic and humorous approach. But really, when we're looking at what's happening with, you know, Caliban, obviously we're looking at it in a post-colonial lens in Atwood's novel, and the inmates themselves engage in a great discussion about the character of Caliban and the rights that anybody might have to enslave him, you know. And Margaret Atwood ties this in with First Nation characters in her novel, who speak to Caliban and his plight as well. So I know that in the Tempest, you know, there is this element where, you know, Shakespeare is trying to develop some empathy towards Caliban. I mean, think of how beautifully Caliban speaks and the beautiful speeches he produces. It reminds me very much of like Othello, in the way that he speaks. So while Shakespeare's trying to highlight that, albeit in his Jacobean era way, Atwood is really making this comment, and I guess that's where the title Hagseed comes from. So Hagseed is Caliban. So Felix says to the inmates, "You're not allowed to swear, or if you're going to swear, you have to use the Elizabethan swear words. You have to use Shakespeare's swear words from the play." And Hagseed becomes one of them. And one of the really, really cool ways that Caliban is like sort of framed is towards the end of the novel, the inmates have to produce a bit of a paper on what they think happened to their characters afterwards.
Yeah.
And one group actually discusses how they believe there's aspects of the play that refers to Caliban as potentially being Prospero's son, and this idea that because Prospero couldn't claim or control or mold him as his own, that he's turned against him. And this really lovely, Caliban will, they give him power, he'll become his own man and he'll go off and do great things. And it's a real empowerment that Atwood gives to a very disempowered figure in the play.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I like that sort of idea that you've got, these dissonances and resonances have definitely been highlighted by what you've been saying. What about this idea of reimagining? How would you sort of look at that idea when you're looking at the second text?
Yeah. So with reimagining, Prospero's plight or Felix's plight, there's definitely more nuance in how revenge and creativity is explored, because we know there's more nuance because the revenge is like a buildup of things. It's not just one kind of inciting incident, but it's the complexity of the Miranda and the spirit Miranda and everything that the play The Tempest represented, which he wasn't able to do because of his usurpation, I guess, in the modern world. So we get, and then what we get is a real commentary of creativity as well, because you really see how Felix as the author would take control of these stories to craft a story that he wanted. And Anne-Marie is the actress who was going to play the original Miranda, and he calls her back to play Miranda now in the inmate prison, which obviously has some, very funny moments because she's the one lady in the prison, and but she's also, I guess she's, Miranda, she's like the Miranda if Miranda in Tempest could be her own free woman and could express herself how she wanted to. So in that regard, Atwood takes a very feminist approach with Anne-Marie's Miranda. Miranda is also very creative. Not only is she an actress, but she's a dancer, which just impresses all the inmates immensely. And she uses that creativity to help the inmates. Much of the way the inmates interpret the characters in their version of The Tempest is they turn some of the speeches and sections into raps. So, again, this idea of how creativity transforms each and every one of us, like how, because Felix will talk about this is the man's rap sheet, and yet, you see them obviously in a new, amazing, creative light because they've been allowed to have that power and that creativity and that autonomy. So, that I think is really interesting. I also really like one other kind of reimagining. So I talked a bit about Ariel, how he's sort of reimagined with the technology. But there's this element as well where with Spirit Miranda, when he goes back to his home, Spirit Miranda wants to be part of the production. She wants to be part of the play. And he tells her she can be Ariel's understudy. And there's a moment towards the end when Ariel's almost finished, or Eight Hands is almost finished, and he's talking into his headset, that they hear a new Ariel, and Felix is like, that's my... that's my daughter, that's my Miranda. And in the end, when they finish the performance, Felix, and he gets his revenge and all of that, he realizes he has to let Miranda go. So very much how Prospero lets Ariel's spirit be and be free. He realizes that he's been holding on to Spirit Miranda, and he's almost entrapped her. And so that he is no longer trapped in his own mind as well. He needs to let her go. And that becomes where the play then ends with new beginnings. So it ends as a tie back that he's going to go on a cruise. So again, we've got ships and water, you know, the imagery of water being cleansing, you know, so that's going to happen. Perhaps 8 hands will come and join him. And there's also that fatherly relationship with Anne-Marie. That's like the relationship that he would have had with Miranda that he missed out on. And even with Estelle, like one thing that I've noticed more recently is Estelle, who's his supervisor, she's like the celestial powers and spirits that Prospero draws on to be able to create his magic. And there's that real sense of without her, he can't do that magic. So, I think in terms of the beauty with Tempest Hagseed is there's so much to talk about. But in terms of like common ideas and values, so both are looking at colonization and power. So on one hand, Prospero's control of Caliban and Ariel, but in a more modern discussion, not only can you talk about colonization, but you can also talk about freedom and identity. Redemption being central to both the texts. So for Prospero, his redemption comes from, you know, forgiveness, whereas for Felix, his redemption comes out of the cathartic process of using that narrative of Tempest to later rest all his grief and his anguish and, you know, all his demons to be able to move forward. And so the in that regard, how art and creativity can transform our body and soul. Absolutely, I think is something in terms of sorry, what were we going to say?
Yeah. No. So you've got a few great ideas there. And I guess the rubric does focus a lot on like the how. So we sort of discussed some of these resonances, dissonances, the imagined sort of things. And the how is, you know, we're starting to look at textual features, some of the styles, the features, the conventions. So how would you unpack that for our teachers here?
So obviously with Shakespeare, you know, you've got the iambic pentameter and the rich imagery, which makes it really lyrical. Atwood has obviously a more contemporary language. She is harking back to the Tempest with having the inmates swear within more Shakespeare's bawdy language. But she's also got a lot of great use of puns and irony and really clever, witty banter that is very, you know, Shakespeare-esque. The character parallels absolutely are a big feature for not only for a resonance, but for allowing maybe a reimagining to occur. So with some of our characters, they're much more resonant, like your Felix and your Prospero are very similar. But, you know, if you're looking at like your Ariel or your Miranda, you can talk about the reimagining there and how Atwood uses her contemporary context to bring out those characters in a deeper way. The settings, so you've got, you know, the island within the original play, and the island is recreated in the theatre of Felix's world. But you've also got the cabin and then the prison of his own mind. In terms of like motifs and symbols, so obviously the Tempest itself is very deeply used across both, representing not only the ability for chaos to ensue, but also for transformation and newness to occur. Because the storm is like represents their inner turmoil, but you know that saying, you know, the blue sky after the storm, like once the storm has been able to clear, we're refreshed, nature's renewed. So I think, there's a lot of like, I think pathetic fallacy playing in there, and just the theatricality of the storm as well, you know, symbolizes Felix and where he has been in Tempest emotionally all these years.
It's a lot of romantic imagery, I guess, that we see used.
Very much so. A
No,
lot of
definitely.
whimsy. Like it's funny. It's very fun. Like I know that I know the novel has moments that are really sad, like the moments with Spirit Miranda, but there's just so much whimsy and fun. Even the way that the characters, the banter, there's always fun, witty, good banter. So I think that's what's quite nice about this as well. The way that she's
Yeah.
allowing the whimsy to come forth, but also
Mm.
allow those deeper messages to be considered as well.
I like that actually with Hagseed again. We sort of see it's a bit of
Mm,
a, I guess you'd consider it to be like a grittier novel, but the
mm,
humor is used always. Humor becomes like something that focuses on art's healing power as well, that you often
yes.
see in that text.
Yeah.
So no, that's definitely fantastic, and you've got a few
Very
great
tragic
ideas
comic
there.
at the same time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you've got some good, focus areas there for teachers to sort of
Mhm,
look at. So language and style, you've
mhm,
got, the motif and symbolism, great areas to start off with if you're, a bit
mhm.
stranded as to where we're going, because the shaping of meaning is the how.
Yeah.
We need to be able to
Yeah.
address that in our essays, which I guess we can lead into now, because
Yeah.
obviously we're going to have to be developing good comparative essays for this section in the HSC. So what are some strategies that our listeners
Yeah.
can use to create these compelling thesis arguments and statements
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
ties together both their comparative analysis of the Tempest and Hagseed?
Yeah. So some ways for students to start making some comparisons, you can start with the themes there and ask them to connect the explore a central theme, and then in what ways is it, resonance, or does it have a dissonance, and look at how maybe how themes can be more representative of big picture concepts and worldly
Mm,
ideas.
mm,
And I'll probably look at that a bit when we look at kind of thesis statements. But you could do thematic based, you can do context based analysis. So you can lean into a certain idea but look at it through the angle of how the switching out of the context actually changes that moment or that aspect or that idea or that character. And then
mm,
another way to do it is more like technique and language based. So you could use characters to anchor you and then move on from there. You might
yeah.
actually anchor it with a structural feature. Like you might
Mm,
talk about symbolism, you might use motif, you might
mm,
use elements of tragedy or elements of humor. I think the thing with Tempest Hagseed, it's such a popular text at HSC marking that yes, we want students to work with the ideas we're presenting them, but the more
mm,
unique their responses can be and the more unique of an angle their analysis will be, I think it really will enable them to shine. So these are all
yeah.
really good starting points, but the best responses will come out of students considering all these things that I'm talking about, and then in light of that, what do they think, and then how do they
Yeah.
move forward?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's definitely true. And you sort of got that idea there with the different types of thesis statements. Yeah. So I guess
Mhm.
when we want to look at some of these thesis statements, you sort of said, maybe pick a theme or a concept or an idea. So zero in on something. For
Yeah.
example, you've got like power and redemption, and how each text might handle it. You mentioned this idea of comparing characters. And
Mhm.
I really like this sort of last idea of, contextual type
Mhm.
analysis, where you might consider, tying Shakespeare's colonial world to Atwood's modern one. And,
Yes.
these are some examples. So do you have any examples there that we could probably guide our teachers with?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing you can do is when you're looking at power and control, that's a perfect opportunity for students to explore the colonial representations of power and control versus the post-colonial. So you definitely don't want your students blocking out paragraphs with just the Tempest or just
Yeah.
Hagseed. What you really want is an intertwining, because
Mm,
that's really going to highlight the dialogism and the conversation happening between the text.
yeah.
So, if I was looking at the power and control, you're looking at how Atwood's more modern retelling reframes this struggle in a contemporary society by looking at vengeance and redemption in a more post-colonial world. And instead of looking at colonized people as being entrapped within power, you might be looking at inmates, prison systems, or, people who might be suffering and are
Yeah.
entrapped within their own grief even. So
Yeah.
that's one way where you can separate those worlds.
Mm,
Um, Another one when you're looking at revenge and forgiveness. So when you're looking at the Tempest, you've got a much more Jacobean, Elizabethan view of, revenge, that idea that, usurpation is like the ultimate wrong. And therefore Prospero in that regard is free to seek revenge on him because what was rightfully his was taken. But when you reframe that by Atwood's more modern context, you see that there's a lot more nuance, because part of the thing is Felix is seeking revenge for something that's partly of his making. I know that's alluded to a bit in The Tempest, but it really is much more nuanced in the novel, and it allows for Felix to consider, what is revenge? Does it actually, give us what we need, or is that just part of our human folly and human fallibility? And is forgiveness perhaps when we truly know that we've moved on and we don't need revenge anymore because we've been able to forgive and release that inner demon and inner anger from within? So the other thing with that too is Atwood uses this idea of the transformative power in art as a way to release this vengeance we might have within us and a way to transform us, which is, very, very so much to talk about in the novel, and a really nice conceptual kind of angle. So, in that regard, you've used themes there, but you've used them to create an overall commentary on kind of human interaction and our human complexity. I think that's what will make it much more a conceptual thesis. And then your students can still break down those thematic concerns within their body paragraph, but they're really, what they're doing is they're using that to proof their overarching concept.
Yeah, I love that idea of an overarching concept as opposed to just a purely thematic-based thesis statement, because it gives you a greater scope, your students greater scope then to, write about multiple sort of things. And it also allows, like, if you're developing a pre-written response for them to take into the essay, it allows that malleability and the ability to adapt your essay to the question a lot easier, like makes it a lot easier.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's something to consider.
Definitely. And I know as well, another one that's really popular is colonization and identity. So I have seen some responses where the paper is really looking at the colonized, post-colonialization, how we look at identity politics, how we look at prejudice and racism. So that's another angle that I've seen. And obviously in Shakespeare's world, you can't blame Shakespeare. He can only do what he knows at his time. But in a more modern retelling, therefore, Caliban is able to be teased out as the Hagseed. And then the other one that I like that has a lot more nuance, which I find is also not a super popular choice, but looking at the idea between like magic or illusion. So, the illusions and reality. So obviously in the play, we're using, it's actual magic to produce these illusions. And then you have a lot of motifs about like sleep and dreams and real and not real. And it's actually a really nice I think, concept to consider within Hagseed, because there's almost this element in Hagseed of, well, if Miranda is real in her mind, then why isn't she not real anyway? She's just real in a different way. And I think that's I think it's a metaphysical interpretation that's really powerful, because it's again going back to that creativity, like how creative our minds are. Like, why do things have to be only in that physical and tangible? Why can't the metaphysical have its part? And are things any less real just because they might be not necessarily physical or tangible? And I think that allows a really like ontological, metaphysical discussion to take place in a paper. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, you've covered quite a bit in today's sort of little episode that we've got here.
I'm not sure if it was clear or rambly, when you're like, okay, good, I'm glad. I hope that was helpful to everyone.
I think there's some great things that people
and these
can
are tip of the that's right. And these are tip of the icebergs, and there are certainly many approaches, but even if I think you start with a few of these and you engage your students in discussion, you'll find out more nuanced interpretations as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, anyway, guys, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Lit Happens, and we've had, such a great conversation with Belle regarding Tempest and Hagseed. Yes, part of our Module A Textual Conversations unit. Remember, just a few key takeaways. We've explored a few of the things in regards to purpose for this module. We've looked at, what each text is about in a brief sort of manner. And we've uncovered some of those resonances, those dissonances, those shared strategies for, I guess, building those strong thesis statements here towards the end. So hopefully we've given you guys a few fresh insights into how you might approach this in your classroom. Just a reminder, guys, that we will be having episodes coming up with most of our texts recently. And if you've looked at some of the amazing stuff that Belle has been popping up onto our Instagram page and, the resources that have been going up, we are going to start to, pump these out a bit more. So jump on board, have a look at our examples here, give us a like and a subscribe. I will also encourage you guys, if you are listening to our Spotify or Apple podcasts, please give us a rating and leave a comment. It does help us as we're starting off on this journey in order to, get the word out there. We're doing a bit. We're jumping off the deep end here with this little project, and we're super duper excited as to what we have in store for us.